Module 8, the central nervous system, the cerebrum in more detail. Let's now talk more about the cerebrum. It's divided into two hemispheres by the longitudinal fissure, and each of the hemispheres can further be divided into lobes. You'll be happy to know that the lobes are named by the skull bones that are above them. In this side view of the brain, you can see that the temporal lobe is located here, and it's bounded by a lateral fissure. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and smell, as well as being involved in memory and abstract thought. The frontal lobe is located on the anterior part of the brain. It's bounded by the lateral fissure and the central sulcus. The frontal lobe is involved in mood, emotions, foresight, and memory. The occipital lobe does not have fissure or sulcus boundaries, but it has unique functions, receiving and integrating your visual information. The parietal lobe takes in all the sensory information we have not as yet covered, everything except for smell, sight, and hearing. We can actually narrow down where on the cerebrum specific functions occur. The primary somatic sensory area is also called the primary somatic sensory cortex. Cortex just refers to a specific area. Somatic has to do with the whole body. So this part of the brain takes in general sensory input from all over the body. It's located almost exclusively on one gyrus. Gyrus is singular for gyri, so this cortex is on one fold. This gyrus is located just behind the central sulcus, so this fold is also called the postcentral gyrus. We can say that the location on the brain, its physical area, is called the postcentral gyrus. The functional area, then, is where on the brain a specific function occurs, and that would be the primary somatic sensory area. However, that function doesn't occur on the entire postcentral gyrus, just most of it. The primary somatic sensory area has specific spots on it that correspond to every part of your body's surface. There's a spot that receives action potentials from the receptors on your hand, another spot that receives action potentials from your elbow, another spot from your knee, and so on. That way, when a signal arrives to this cortex, your brain knows exactly where the signal comes from. This area, then, localizes the sensations coming in from the body. What do I mean by localized body sensations? Well, if you suddenly feel a drop of rain, you know exactly what spot on your body just got wet, without even having to look at it, right? This is what is meant by localization. How did scientists figure out exactly what spot on the cerebrum is responsible for receiving stimuli from a specific area of the body? Well, it's a pretty fascinating account. Back in the 1950s, scientists conducted experiments with patients by surgically opening up a person's skull so that their brain was exposed. Now, the patients remained awake, so the surgeons could cause a light shock to the spot on the primary somatic sensory area on the brain and ask the patient what he felt. The shocks created action potentials that would stimulate parts of the body. Then the patient would then say he felt something on his ankle or his elbow, depending on where the brain was stimulated. Now that sounds a bit gruesome, but you need to realize that our brains have no pain receptors. We do have them on the skull and the brain coverings though, so the surgeons used local anesthetic to numb those pain receptors, and the patients felt no pain, other than the tingling sensation they felt in their body when the brain was stimulated by the weak shock. This phenomenon is actually quite helpful for patients with brain injuries. During surgery, the surgeon can use general anesthesia to expose the brain, but then the patient is awakened so he can tell the surgeon what's going on, how he feels as the brain is repaired or a tumor is removed. It's truly a fascinating process, isn't it? The next area of the cerebrum I want to talk about is the somatic sensory association area. This area is responsible for figuring out the meaning of the sensations we receive from the primary somatic sensory area. Say you receive a cut on your finger by poking it with a needle. That's a painful feeling, and you instantly know you have to stop the bleeding and bandage the area. But instead, if you were to touch the tip of a pencil at that same spot, you would feel a pointy sensation, but you would interpret that information differently than the cut, right? Your somatic sensory association area is responsible for helping you to know what to do when a stimulus comes in. And this area also creates a sensory memory for you. After feeling the needle prick on your finger and also feeling a pencil tip, you have learned how they each feel and will be more careful around that needle. Your somatic sensory association area has stored that information that came in from previous touch experiences. The occipital lobe has an area called the visual cortex. You might suspect that this has to do with vision or sight, and you would be right. This area receives the action potentials from the optic nerves from the eyes. Those action potentials are then interpreted into shape, color, and size. Then new action potentials are sent from the visual cortex to the visual association area. Like the somatic sensory association area, this area compares the incoming image with past experiences to give you context of what you're looking at. That's why it's easier to recognize someone you know. Those images are stored in the visual association area, so you can quickly identify a person. Have you ever seen someone you're sure you don't know, but they remind you of someone you do know? That's because they have similar features or mannerisms as the person you know, and your visual association area is recognizing that. In this image, you see a red leaf and think it reminds you of an apple. The primary auditory area is located on the temporal lobe. Auditory refers to sound, and this area is responsible for identifying volume and pitch of sound. When patients had this portion of their brain stimulated, they would hear specific pitches but couldn't relate them to anything they knew. That's because the signals have to then travel to the auditory association area, where they're compared to your auditory memory, and you might realize that your friends are singing happy birthday to you. This association area also helps us to make sense of the sounds we hear when someone's talking to us. But there's another part of the brain that helps with understanding speech. It's called Wernicke's area. So to listen to and understand speech, you need the primary auditory area, the auditory association area, and Wernicke's area. Let me go over that again. You first receive auditory signals at the primary auditory area. This is where we identify the volume and pitch of the sounds. Signals are then sent to the auditory association area so that they can be placed into a historical content. At that point, if the brain identifies that these sounds are speech, then more signals are sent to Wernicke's area where the words are understood. You need all three of these areas of your brain to work in order to comprehend the words being spoken to you. If you're studying a foreign language, you're exercising these parts of your brain right now. You see, as you first hear new words, they have no meaning to you. But as you hear those words again and again, your brain identifies the particular pitches and volume to help you recognize them as familiar, thanks to the auditory association area. Then you can comprehend what is being said thanks to Wernicke's area. Truly amazing, isn't it? The taste area of your brain helps you interpret taste, and the olfactory area receives signals from the nose to interpret smells. You cannot see the olfactory area in this diagram because it's located below the frontal lobe inside the lateral fissure, in this area. Or from the frontal view, the lobes are just inside this spot. Well, I've pretty much gone over all the sensory input centers of the cerebrum, but remember, the cerebrum controls motor neurons too. So now let's talk about the areas that control those. The primary motor area, or cortex, is located mainly on one gyrus on each side of the brain. It is anterior to the central sulcus, so this fold is called the precentral gyrus. This part of the brain has been well studied, and we know that it also has sections corresponding to motor neurons from specific areas of the body. This means that there's an area for the leg, the thigh, the arm, the mouth, and so forth. So we can say that this area of the cerebrum controls basic skeletal muscle movement. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the signals originate from this spot on the brain. Think about doing detailed movements rapidly, such as playing the piano, typing, or doing exercises by running through a row of tires. The sequence of action potentials required for fine motor movement has to be worked out ahead of time by an area called the premotor area. This spot on the brain does the preparatory work, figuring out what action potentials have to be sent with specific timing and specific sequences. This information is then sent to the primary motor area, which follows the instructions, causing the motions to happen. The motor speech area is also known as Broca's area, and it's actually a portion of the premotor area. In the same way that the premotor area works out detailed preparatory work for fine motor skills, Broca's area figures out the necessary sequencing for the intricate speech muscles. Think about it. In order to say the alphabet, you don't consciously have to think about how to form your mouth, tongue, and facial muscles for each letter. You just do it, right? Wernicke's area also plays a role in speech. Say you're at a friend's house and you're very thirsty. In order to talk, Wernicke's area figures out which words you need to use to make the statement you want to say. Then, action potentials are generated that travel to Broca's area so it can work out the specific sequence of muscle movements in order to make the words that Wernicke's area determined to use. Broca's area will then send action potentials to the primary motor area so it can set in motion the muscle movements that Broca's area determined needed to be made. And you can politely ask for a drink of water. The large portion of the cerebrum right here is called the prefrontal area. Here is where our capabilities for reason, thinking through ideas, and foreseeing what can happen are located. You know, when your little brother begins stacking blocks so high that the stack is taller than him, you can foresee what will happen next, right? The stack will fall. The prefrontal area is also responsible for providing our motivation and inhibiting our impulses. A lot of these have to do with how we behave or our personality. There's a surgical procedure known as a prefrontal lobotomy. At one time in history, this surgery was performed to help control people who were violent or could not control themselves. It involved the removal of the prefrontal area of the brain. But this procedure damaged the personality from the patients. Thankfully, it's not done anymore, as there are helpful medications that can help people with disturbances in behavior. As I mentioned in an earlier section, the brain is two hemispheres, and the left side takes in sensory information and controls the motor functions on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain takes in sensory information and controls motor functions on the left side of the body. Now this brain image is facing you, so its left side will be to your right. The nerve orientation is due to decussation happening in the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, and parts of the brain. But the hemispheres of the brain also share this information back and forth through structures called commissures. Commissures are connections of neuron axons that allow the two hemispheres of the brain to communicate with one another. The biggest commissure is called the corpus callosum, which I already talked about. Now, though the brain hemispheres look like mirrored image of each other, there are some differences too. For example, Broca's area is pretty much always on the left hemisphere and not on the right. So that means that the left hemisphere of the brain is more involved in speech. The left hemisphere is also stronger in mathematics. The right hemisphere, however, is stronger in determining spatial relationships, music, and identifying images. In sports, it's important to know if a person is left-handed or right-handed. A person could also be left or right-legged, having a dominant leg. That's because the two hemispheres of our brain have a dominant side. They're not exactly equal. Take me, for example. I'm right-eared, right-eyed, right-armed, right-legged, and right-handed. And it's the same for all vertebrates. One side is more dominant than the other. For me, my left brain, my left side is more dominant, so all of my right side of my body is stronger. Now, in the animal kingdom, it's the same way as well, like my friend Jack here. But the interesting phenomenon is this. Most humans are right side dominant, but animals are 50% left and 50% right. We don't know exactly why this is, but it's interesting to know, and it's very important when you want to throw a frisbee. Come on, Jack, ready?